NBC's Ali Vitale is reporting from Capitol Hill. Eugene Daniels is Politico's White House correspondent and an MSNBC political contributor. Tim Miller is former communications director for Jeb Bush's 2016 campaign, host of the Bulwark podcast, and an MSNBC political analyst. Welcome to all of you. So, Ali, what do these leadership challenges tell us about any kind of reckoning within the Democratic Party?
Well, they tell us, Chris, about a reckoning that could perhaps be generational happening at the committee level. But they also tell us a story about how Hakeem Jeffries is stepping into his own as the leader of this party, himself the result of generational shifts within the caucus that happened when Nancy Pelosi and the rest of her leadership ranks left their posts behind and ceded them to the next generation. The trio that Jeffries is now the top part of includes Catherine Clark and Pete Aguilar. But that was the first step of this. And that's the first thing, frankly, that Jeffries talked to me about as an example of the kinds of changes that his party is seeing, if not wholesale, then certainly at some of the committee levels. Listen to what Jeffries said yesterday when I asked him about the jockeying for gavels that we're seeing right now. Watch.
Well, House Democrats have clearly been in the midst of a generational transition, standing on the shoulders of Speaker Emerita Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and Jim Clyburn, along with other longstanding members who we continue to revere. Let me also make clear that House Democrats continue to value the experience that many long-serving members of the caucus bring to the table, as evidenced by the fact that earlier today, unanimously, by acclamation.
And so what Jeffries is talking about at the end there is the fact that while these challenges are going on the other hand, other committee members are doing just fine keeping their position as ranking members. He pointed, for example, to the fact that Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro was recently unanimously put into the place that she's been for several years now as the ranking member on the Appropriations Committee. And so there is jockeying, but there's also more that stays the same. The thing that it tells us about Jeffries, though, and this is something that he has long said, is that the caucus will work its will. He's done a good job and made it clear that unlike Pelosi, who ruled this group with an iron fist, Jeffries holds his personal opinion cards closer to the vest and instead allows his caucus to come to him with the wide range of opinions before he then weighs in. These challenges wouldn't be happening if Jeffries hadn't tacitly allowed them to happen, and so we're seeing the outgrowth of that right now.
So, Eugene, last week you wrote in Playbook that the topic of generational change was no longer simply hot, it's magmatic. Its urgency is undeniable, you wrote. I wonder if Ocasio-Cortez, young, progressive, right, is she a kind of test case maybe in running against someone who is so experienced and frankly, has sort of been building toward this for a very long time. I wonder if she's successful, if it opens other doors potentially for other young, ambitious politicians.
Yeah, I think she is a test case, but she's not the only one, right? Jared Huffman, who is 60, so not exactly young, is also
watch who you're telling that to.
It's young on Capitol Hill, it's young in D.C. But when you're talking about the kinds of changes that the Democratic Party feels like it needs to do, it's not just youth, it's also new ideas and different ways of communicating and, frankly, better ways of communicating. And I think a lot of folks feel like AOC encompasses all of that for a lot of different people. We'll see if her against Jared Connolly actually works. This is a man who's been, as you said, working toward this, who has a lot of respect across the caucus and, frankly, across Capitol Hill. So this will be probably the hottest contested test case that we're seeing. But this is something that's not just happening on Capitol Hill. It's also happening across the country when it comes to the Democratic Party. We have the DNC chair race that is starting to kick off. But you also have Democrats around the country trying to understand what are the changes they need to make within the party to be, in their eyes, more successful, to win more elections. I think right after the presidential election, folks felt really nervous. I think it's starting to die down a little bit as we're seeing some of the ways in which the election wasn't as far apart as folks originally thought. But that means that there is a chance of overcorrecting. And Huffman, when I had him on the Political Deep Dive podcast, talked about the possibility of them overreacting to these kinds of things and to making changes that are too big and are much larger than the party might need to do if they feel like they need to do some tweaks. So all of these postmortems are happening right now in a time where the party also doesn't really have a lot of leadership.
Yeah, there are a lot of postmortems going on, right, Tim? Always happens when you don't have a great election. But one of the things that Eugene just said, that is what I've been hearing as I talk to state legislators, for example, when I talk to people who are in leadership at the state level in state Democratic parties, is finding a better way of communicating. This is no amazing revelation, but how to do it is the subject of a lot of discussions. And I wonder how much Trump and his ability to connect factors into this shift and whether more youthful voices will be seen as a way to strengthen the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I don't think there should be too much of a concern about overcorrecting. If I was the Democrats, I would focus on the correcting part. Look, I mean, yeah, having youthful leaders who speak more colloquially, more authentically, who are comfortable on the platforms where people are consuming information, yep. YouTube, TikTok, social media. I think that is super important. The other things I would be looking at if I was Democrats on the Hill is thinking about how some other potential cultural changes might be helpful within the conference. For example, I don't know that all the leaders should be from New York and California. The Democrats are actually lost some ground in New York and California, but are still doing pretty well there. I think bringing in voices from other parts of the country, from people that won in places where Donald Trump was more successful, might be beneficial. Another thing is, in addition to where they're communicating, how they're communicating and how aggressively they're dealing with Republicans. I think that some of those leaders you showed at the beginning, all good public servants, but come from an era where it's like the Republicans on the other side were John Boehner Republicans, and you deal with John Boehner Republicans in a different way. There's more
Jeb
comedy.
Bush Republicans, somebody
Jeb Bush
right?
Republicans, speaking closer to home. You can make deals with these guys. You can negotiate with them in good faith. That's not this current Republican Party. And I think that the Democrats on the Hill could use some more hard-knuckled tactics in dealing with this Republican Party rather than kind of the more, I think, old school behind-the-scenes, kind of whatever elbow-rubbing tactics that some of the old guard leadership was more used to.
Yeah, I'm curious, Eugene, to what extent you're hearing that. It's not just about getting younger people who know where to go, but also who are willing to be a little more aggressive, who are going to look at what's coming at them and answer in kind, essentially.
Yeah, one of the things that I heard all the time from Democrats across the country, especially younger operatives, were that when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket, when he was seen as the leader of the party, is that he and his team were people who were playing a game by different rules, that the way that politics operates right now is not the way at all, the way that the folks who are winning or getting a lot of the attention are becoming part of the culture like Donald Trump. They talk and act and react differently. And that if you don't do that, you can't win. And what you heard from voters when I was out on the road, I'm sure Ali heard this all the time, I'm sure Tim as well, was that they wanted to see Democrats who fought, right? They wanted to hear from Democrats about defending their rights and those kinds of things, and different types of rights, and it means different things to different people, but that they weren't hearing a fight in the Democrats. And you hear that in Donald Trump, whether people agree with his politics or not, everyone knows that he's a fighter, right? I think across the political spectrum, people understand that. And that is what the American voters saw. And that is what Democratic operatives are looking at and saying, just like Tim is, that we need to do that more. And we need to do it in a way that actually breaks through to people. We can't just talk amongst ourselves about it and then go outside and have like a nice little conversation, right? If you're going to be tough, do it all the way through.
Yeah, and Tim, to be fair, it's not just the Democrats, right? You've got J.D. Vance, who's going to be sworn in as vice president. He's 40. Donald Trump is 78. The next Congress is going to see 82-year-old Mitch McConnell step down from leadership. So I wonder if part of what we're seeing is just the natural order of things, right? Or is it a recognition that this is a country that seems to be tired of the leadership where the Senate, for example, I think the median age is over 65. Several members are in their 80s, and they're looking for a Congress that looks more like them, just to simplify.
Yeah. I do think there's two things that are happening. Look, I like working, so I'm not taking any shots at any boomers that want to keep working past 70. I'm sure I'll probably want to work past 70, but it does feel like people are staying around longer than in past times. So I think there's a little bit of that folks might need to be nudged off the stage a little bit, rather than, I don't know, my grandparents' generation. A lot of them, my grandpa retired at 65, and he was very happy about that. So I think that there's just maybe a cultural change that is happening. But in addition to that, look, people are on it. We've had, 6 straight change elections? Every election since 2012, essentially, has been a change election. And so I think the voters are sending a message that they want change, and it's hard to say that you're listening to them if you're keeping the same old people around.
Yeah, what do you think? What do you think, Allie?
I think that there's a generational shift that is clearly happening here, but then also I'm hearing from members the other side of what Tim is saying, which is that you've got members like Annie Kuster, Dan Kildee, who are leaving the House right now in part because they want to show other members that there is life outside of Washington and start to make that a little bit more of a habit as opposed to what we're seeing broadly. The only other point that I would make, and it's the counter that I've heard from Jeffries time and time again, is that although the leadership apparatus in the top 3 is very coastal, they do have people like Debbie Dingell of Michigan who are in that leadership apparatus too, and they would point to the fact that they were able to regain seats in places like New York and California while also putting up a fight in other key places like Michigan and Pennsylvania, although they did lose one of the critical seats there in Pennsylvania's 7th. So there is a little bit of that back and forth that we're already seeing play out here on the Hill.